Thank you very much. As our chair announced earlier, that she was not going to be here for this portion of the afternoon prior to that. However, out of respect for time, I'd like to get the meeting started. Dr. Levine, you are the first person on the agenda.
Thank you. I'm Mark Levine, Commissioner of Health. And I've been invited here with a three-part request. Number one, to hear about the health impacts of PFAS, the importance of getting it out of the environment, and the department's role in the Act 131 report. Can I share now? Yeah, it looks like I can. I only have very few slides. I would hope the committee has some appreciation for the health effects of PFAS, because it almost seems out of order to be coming in maybe later in the process when it's all about health. But I'm happy to expound on the health effects of PFAS to reinforce whatever work you may be doing. And
I would find it really helpful because I haven't gotten enough information. I understand it's a dangerous chemical, but how it relates to health and impacts human health. You could
absolutely.
just.
And the way we know about this is through, first of all, animal studies, which of course are not directly extrapolatable to humans, but certainly we learn a tremendous amount from them, no matter what the toxic substance is that we're thinking about. Second way is epidemiologic studies, meaning we look at populations of humans, try to assess what exposures they may have had, and draw associations between exposures and disease outcomes. And that's usually the state of the art in toxicology, because as you might imagine, it's unethical to do a randomized controlled trial in a human being of provide a little PFAS and see what happens versus don't have any PFAS. So we can't really do things that way. And then the third way we learn is, at least in Vermont, through direct experience, because we are a state that has had its experience with PFAS to date. And though we, again, don't have large population numbers, so it's hard to make very major conclusions, we can at least see if what we've seen and what people in communities like the Bennington area have complained about, and if it's consistent with what you see with these substances. So what we've learned about PFAS in aggregate, with all that data that I'm just describing, are things that we think are quite plausible biologically and toxicologically, and that really makes sense looking at all of the literature. It's a consistent theme versus things that is still a little uncertainty of. So on this one slide, I've tried to show you the things that there's a high level of confidence about. So from the standpoint of cardiovascular health, the major impact is on increases in cholesterol levels. From immune health, it's really how do we respond to infections? And in the case of the youngest among us, how do we respond to vaccines? And do we mount an antibody response to the vaccine to protect us from future infections? And there have been findings that the response is not as robust in those at the very early end of the age spectrum. third area is a little before we become an infant, and it's in pregnancy. And there have been associations with high blood pressure in pregnancy, which is a risk factor in itself to what's called preeclampsia, which is a severe obstetric outcome. Getting back to the infants, developmental effects, including increase in birth weight, some evidence that the distribution of weight is different in terms of muscle mass being less, adipose mass being a little greater. I didn't lead with cancer, but that's always what people fear the most. And the two cancers that are most highly associated with PFAS compounds are kidney and testicular. There are some questions about prostate cancer as well. The liver, of course, is the organ that filters waste in our body, tries to deal with toxins and metabolize medications, etc. And there have been found to be elevation in liver enzyme levels indicating some toxic stress on the liver and an inflammatory response. And then in the endocrine or hormone part of our body systems, the thyroid is the one that's most commonly considered. If that's happening at the level of someone in their first months or years of life, that can have significant effects on growth development. But it can also occur later in life. And there's also some evidence for perhaps adrenal or estrogen type of sex hormones. Now, these kinds of effects are both acute and chronic. We usually think of them as more on the chronic range, like you have a lifetime of exposure through the well you're drinking from or through your community's water supply, which nobody identified this in until a later stage. And it's like, well, okay, you're at risk for X, Y, and Z because you've had chronic effects of PFAS. But I want to emphasize that in the neurodevelopmental part, so pregnancy, having a fetus, eventually delivering a baby, and then early part of life, that's pretty acute exposure where some of those impacts can be significant at that point in time and dictate what happens later on, like for instance, with the thyroid and growth development. So you need to think about them in both ways. So especially vulnerable population being the very young and the pregnant, but all of us being vulnerable in terms of more chronic exposure. And indeed, these are, as I'm sure this committee is aware, the chemicals that have been called forever drugs or forever chemicals, meaning when they're in the environment, they kind of stay in the environment for a very long time. So unwittingly, we may have many exposures over long periods of time that don't seem to cause us any problem because we're doing just fine and dandy. That might present with things later on, perhaps decades later. And indeed, these are a class of incredibly commonly used chemicals, and I'm not going to go into a discourse on that because I would assume you've all heard about that. But there are literally thousands and thousands of these used in all kinds of arenas, some of which I know there are bills to potentially prevent from happening in the state of Vermont. So let me pause on the health impact and just see if there's general questions in that arena before I move on to the other things I was asked to talk about.
Yes, Sarita.
Is it respiratory? Is it breathing it in? Is it on our skin? I mean, does it go through our skin?
So most of it's not respiratory in this case. The respiratory is the PCBs that we've been testing for in schools. That is actually in building materials that then gets emitted into the air, and people, kids, school staff and teachers in schools, whatever, breathe it in. And that's how they get exposed to that. With the PFAS compounds, it's much more commonly associated with water supply. And that's why you've heard a lot from DEC, all about the impacts on public drinking water. We in the health department have some role with people who are in the 40-ish% of Vermonters who use well or spring water. And not all of those are tested, though they can be. So a lot of that is in the water. Some of that is in ingestion of foods. So there's been a lot of conversation about the packaging materials for foods. So the food itself might have been fine, but because of the packaging material, it became contaminated with these, and then that gets ingested. There can be some skin. I don't want to say it's impossible.
Yeah, but
And in that realm, I'm thinking about things like the now not used but previously used firefighting foams that people could be exposed to in their line of business at an airport.
and ski wax.
And ski wax. What you've got to know about a lot of these things, though, is there's sort of a dose response. So some you might get a decent dose all the time on a chronic basis, like, drinking something that has it in the water, versus applying a ski wax that may have this in there to do the nice glide that you want to get, but at the same time may not be at a significant enough level and not used, often enough to have the same cumulative risk that drinking water every day does.
Thank you.
Yes, Representative. All right.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Doc, for coming in and talking about this. And you mentioned not using human people or using people as a test.
Yes.
product, and I appreciate that. I'm not volunteering. But with the Bennington incident, with the contamination of the wells.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was there data collected about an increase in occurrences of cancer such that
So-
I'd forgotten the whole story?
Yeah, so there is data being collected, and there are families and individuals who believe they have outcomes that are directly related to this. So we're often asked to do sort of cancer cluster kind of analysis to see if you lived here, is your rate of a certain cancer higher than if you lived there? Very hard to do with small population areas. And with toxins that work, except for the neurodevelopmental infant stuff, they work chronically over time and take a certain level of exposure over a certain number of years. And everyone has variations in how long they've been in that community and been exposed. So it is very challenging to do that work because of numbers and statistics. But yes, the answer to your question is obviously we're looking at that very seriously. And there are people who have stories that you hear, and it's like hard to deny that it would be related to the PFAS compounds, but at the same time, it may not be at a rate that you can identify that seems to be elevated for the population. Even if for that individual, it seems like that may be a real reason. And this is indeed an issue with toxicology because we deal with looking for these outcomes over time that we know are clearly correlated with exposure to these substances, but not everyone's going to get that. And some are going to get it earlier than later. So it's always a challenge, especially, like I said, in places where populations are not in the tens or hundreds of thousands, but they're much smaller.
Representative Norris.
Yes, thank you, Commissioner, for coming in and sharing your knowledge with us on this topic. It's very helpful. So PFAS chemicals are sometimes called forever chemicals.
Yes.
Does that mean they get forever stored in your body, or that they just themselves last forever? Once you ingest it, does it pass through you eventually, or does it stay in?
Great
us forever?
question. So I think the term was coined more for the environment, mainly because there's nothing in the environment that really breaks them down. Now, indeed, some really fascinating research going on with some microbes that actually may do that better than others. But on a grander scale, once they're in the environment, they don't go anywhere very fast. When they're in the human environment, yes, there is an opportunity, often through the kidney, which may be why it's impacted more, but as well through the liver, to try to detoxify this and get rid of it and get it out of the body. But we can still measure it in people. Now, we don't recommend people just get a blood test to see. We look more at their exposure. If their exposure is pretty robust, because of where they happen to live, let's say, we'd rather they assume that they've had an exposure that could be meaningful, and then the proper surveillance testing for various outcomes can be done in their clinician's office, versus just submitting yourself to a blood test. If the blood test is high, getting all concerned about that, but also certainly you'll get all the same screening testing done, versus if your blood test was low or normal, meaning, well, would you blow off the fact that you've been living in that house for 30 years and drinking that water and it was just discovered to have PFAS in it? You probably wouldn't want to lower your guard. You'd want to go through the same process. So we don't necessarily encourage testing, but in more recent literature, it is actually having a greater uptake and trying to correlate it as another data point with everything else going on for a person.
But nominally, physiologically, once ingested, it does get captured by the liver, kidney, and excreted. I mean, it doesn't stay in us forever.
Well, no, if you could measure it in your blood, it means it's been in you. You don't know how much of that is from your recent intake versus chronic, but it generally will stay in a lot of your tissues forever.
Forever. Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So the human race and animals generally have a lower threshold but baseline level of exposure. This is true for many things that are toxic to us, which you probably don't want to know more about. But the environment we live in does have a lot of these things.
Sure.
And so when we measure them in people, we have to be careful to understand that there's a sort of baseline level that is sort of in the background. We call it a background level because that's what there is now, versus something that exceeds that.
Representative Tagli.
We've heard testimony about forever chemicals, that they're ubiquitous, and to kind of follow on with Representative Nord's question. Apparently we can test for it in the blood. Is there a level in the blood that would trigger a concern by a doctor? Or does it vary so much within people? Is it that we know that's going to cause some sort of an issue, a health issue?
So again, I think that's why I said the exposure history is more important than the level, because clearly there'll be a level that will say, oh, we've got to look for X, Y, and Z and continue to screen for these regularly at regular intervals. But if you've had the exposure history, we want to say the same exact thing, because based on your exposure, we think your risk is still at that level of high, versus needing a blood test to tell us we better get more aggressive with the screen. We want to use your exposure history to your benefit. Now, we don't want to like freak you out either, and this is the delicate part of this, because if we're going to say, well, we're going to check your urine sample every year, we're going to check an ultrasound of your kidney every year, we're going to do tumor markers for testicular cancer on you every year. You can't deny that's going to make somebody anxious, even if they may never develop any of those outcomes at all. So it's always a very delicate dance about, we know you've had the exposure, so we owe it to you to look for these things and try to find them early at a time when we can do something about them, versus just blow them off and say, well, you've had an exposure, but you'll probably be fine. It's hard to do that.
One other question, well, it's two-part. You said a urine sample, does that imply that sometimes PFAS will pass through? We can metabolize?
No, I'm using the urine sample as a way to diagnose something wrong with your kidney, not to look for the PFAS. But yes, you can find it in the urine. So it's possible to find it in the urine for sure.
Is there a way to detoxify your body from it?
No. So like with a toxic thing like lead, which we talked about a lot, there is a binding agent that can actually help lower the lead level in a person's blood. We don't really have that for this. And lead, of course, is an element on that chemical
Right.
elemental chart. PFAS is a very complicated substance. All those Fs are fluorinated ligands, and there's a bunch of other things in there. So it's a pretty complicated structure. And there are thousands of variations for that.
Can the state lab test PFAS? He's still sending it out.
Oh, I'm not sure if we're still testing for it, but we'll get you the answer to that. Want to say yes, but I don't want to. There may be a 5% of me that says I'm not 100% sure. So
Well, the reason I'm asking the question is our municipality has PFAS in their water supply. And
Yeah.
all the testing takes a fair amount of time,
Yes.
it's very a lot of money to
Right.
do this once a month.
Sure.
Historically, EPA has said 70 parts per trillion. The state has said 20 parts per trillion, and there's a migration south to 4 parts per trillion. And there's some that are advocating 0 parts per trillion.
Yes.
How is 0 parts per trillion attainable?
I think it's unattainable. Do I think 4 parts per trillion is attainable? It could well be, definitely. There are laboratories that can only measure accurately down to 4 to 7 parts per trillion. Other laboratories can go well below that. So it does have some impact on knowing what the laboratory's capability is. But the reality is, it would be asking a lot of a water supply to get the level 0, but I leave the rest of that to my DEC colleagues, because there are a lot of filtration systems that are available to deal with this problem. I don't know how low they can go. So I have to ask Mr. Chapman and his colleagues.
Thank you.
So the other things were the importance of getting it out of the environment and the department's role in the Act 131 report. So those are very short answers. I've impressed upon you the fact that once they're in the environment, they're in the environment. And it takes a long time to see them disappear, if they disappear at all. So the goal of current legislation in front of you and all the testimony you've been taking, I'm sure, is restricting it in various products to prevent it from entering the environment in even greater levels. So clearly the health department is interested in not adding to the burden of on the environment of having more PFAS go into it. Because that can only lead to more environmental exposures, whether it be of an animal, whether it be of fish, whether it be of human beings. So we're certainly aligned with wanting it to not increase further than where it is now. And I think everybody pretty much is in agreement with that. That's why the EPA finally and definitively came out in the last year or two, trying to move south, as you just described, and get the levels to at least the commoner compounds very low, and to derive an index that we could use for even some of the uncommon compounds to try to make sure that they're not at high enough levels to cause problems. The Act 131 report was done with a lot of input. It was done by DEC and the Agency of Natural Resources, but clearly it had input by a number of other parts of state government, including the Department of Health. And so I would regard us as in consultation with us, I guess I would call it. We played a role in reviewing, participating in some writing and editing and drafting. Toxicologist from the Department of Health and a toxicologist from the Department of Agriculture worked closely together with everyone else in our support for getting that report right. So I guess that's what our role was.
Any further questions for Dr. Levine? Yes.
The amounts, how do they base that on? I mean, do they base it based on an average lifespan of a person, or, I mean, how, how do they determine what level? What is that based on? My father-in-law used to be a chemist at Pfizer, and he would test different things. He said, yeah, you have arsenic in so many parts. Back then, I think it used to be million, not trillion.
Sure.
But he says it will kill you if you drink 5 gallons of water a day for 250 years. You will die. So I'm trying to figure out what are we basing, how do we base that? And is that the same baseline for any type of?
Yeah, no, it's a different baseline for every
everything.
substance. Some we do parts per million, some we do parts per trillion, some are nano parts. So the technology has improved obviously over time for everything. And we can now discern levels at much lower concentrations than ever before. So that's really critical. But then there's the epidemiologic and animal evidence that's factored into understanding exposure levels. There's laboratory science that goes on to look at exposure levels. There's efforts made to try to discern a level where you will not see a lot of untoward outcomes.
Okay.
And a level where you clearly will. And that's sort of the science of toxicology. And you get into some very complicated mathematical formulas to really look at concentrations and what they're present in the environment at versus in certain substances, what have you, but trying to get down to exactly where we see the most toxicity and where we might see the least toxicity, and hence have a minimal contamination level or what have you, so that if you're below that, you can breathe a little easier and feel more comforted that though the substance itself is bad, you may not have encountered it in a concentration that might harm. So, I mean, this is toxicology. It's a pretty complicated field, actually. And because we can't do direct experiments on people, obviously there are experiments done on animals, there's natural history experiences of people, and epidemiology. And all of that's put together to try to arrive at what seems to be a reasonable level.
Before it causes a health issue,
Well, that's the goal, is
That
what
would be-
level can it be in your environment, but not concern you that it will cause you a great problem. So with something like lead, we are very comfortable saying 0. Because we know that any lead, whether it's an infant eating paint off a wall painted in older days, or whether it's an infant drinking water in their daycare, where the lead is at too high level, we know that that's associated with potential neurologic and brain damage. And there's no level where it isn't associated with that. These other substances, the hope is, and usually what we find is that there's, I wouldn't want to use the word safe levels, but there are safer levels that won't have the same impact. Understanding that the environment is going to have whatever level it has because of what we've done to the planet already, and that there are background levels present in people, and we may not be able to intervene, do anything about those background levels. So we can't set our level at 0 if everybody's got a level that's higher than 0 just because they've lived on the planet Earth. So it has to be a bit pragmatic. Hope I'm framing that. Understandable.
Representative Austin, and then Bartholomew.
It may be self-evident, but how does PFAS enter the water?
Head to the water?
Enter it.
Oh, enter it. So it basically is in the ground,
Oh, it is.
and anything in the soil can eventually get in the water. So
But
when
this-
you look at what happened, like in, say, in Bennington, you know, the whole thesis of the lawsuit is that this company made products that had these chemicals in them. They leached into the ground, into the soil, sometimes into the water in that plant, and spread further and further and further throughout that region.
So we have a list of products.
Yeah.
How does it come from that product? Clothing, you know, AstroTurf, rugs.
Yeah, yeah.
Furniture, how does it come from that into the water?
So it doesn't have to be in the water
Right,
exclusively,
yeah.
but
Or how does it, if
Sure.
you sit on the couch, does it, I mean, I'm trying to.
Right,
understand.
so it can come into contact with you.
Mhm.
Let's say you put on a raincoat that has it as a water repellent. You may get direct contact just wearing the coat,
Mhm.
and again through skin absorption.
Skin, okay.
But landfills, outdoor things like water repellent, you know, outdoor furniture, things of that sort are can eventually get into the soil.
Mhm.
And then, you know, it's especially concerning if people have wells that are located in areas that could become impacted by the soil around them.
Thank you. Landfills.
Representative Bartholomew.
Can you give more information about the animal studies that were done? Like what species,
Oh, it's a
presumably
Yeah.
chronic versus acute studies?
yes. So
Are they mostly rodents?
So I wouldn't want to characterize it as mostly rodents, because there's always an effort in these studies to get to species that are more like humans. I can get you a firmer answer from our toxicologist about percentage of studies that are in what kind of animals. But it's not just classic mice studies that we learned everything from.
It's not very easy to do studies with non-human primates these days, though, so.
No, understandable, right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Let me stop sharing, so I free up here.
You can send us your slides.
Yes. Stay for what's next, or
You certainly can if you wish.
what's next?
Next is Chris Parenti, AGC America.
Is that your quote, Doctor?
I might steal some. There. Afternoon. Vice Chair Labor, ranking members Secowitz, and members of the committee. As noted, I'm Chris Carenti. I am the president and CEO of AGC America. AGC America is an international company, and we have multiple different manufacturing businesses in the US, including chemicals business, which I'll talk a little bit about here in a second. We have automotive glass, we have life sciences, we have some electronic materials businesses and an R&D center. So appreciate the opportunity to get to talk to you today. And we provide testimony on H238. Let me first say that I've testified in a number of hearings around the United States on PFAS legislation. And I've said this to every legislature that has approached this type of legislation. We applaud you for taking on this battle. We know it's a difficult battle. PFAS chemicals that are causing some of the contamination issues that Dr. Levine told you about and covered are things that are of serious concern to a lot of communities. And we think that it's certainly something that has to be tackled and has to be dealt with. We've actually supported PFAS legislation around the country. In Colorado, their new bill they enacted last year. And I just came back from New Mexico, where they're considering a PFAS bill for the first time, and testified and provided testimony on that bill. Also met with the Environmental Secretary, Secretary Kinney, and the Economic Development Secretary to talk about their bill and also to talk about an issue that's important for our company and is actually important for the residents of Vermont, along with other states, which are fluoropolymers. So fluoropolymers are encompassed within the broad definition of PFAS because it's a very, very broad definition that is used in this bill and other bills around the country. But fluoropolymers are a unique brand of PFAS. It's non-toxic. It's not bioavailable, so it doesn't get absorbed into your blood. It doesn't dissolve in water. And it is an inert material. Like I said, like a lot of other PFAS, it doesn't have the small molecules. So PFOA or PFOS or the chemicals that are of most concern, smaller molecules. They can be absorbed much easier. Fluoropolymers have large molecules and they stay together. And I'll give you some examples here in a second. But ultimately, they are extremely important for safety and reliability and the lifespan of all kinds of products around that people use every day that are important for industry, important for renewable energy. The products that use fluoropolymers need very, very good resistance to damage, good resistance to the environment, environmental conditions, extreme cold, extreme heat. And they need to be able to perform certain important chemical and electrical properties in a lot of different applications. Fluoropolymers have a very unique chemistry to allow them to do that. So they are great materials when you really need something to last and you really need something to protect a product with. So this is, I'm going to pass this around. This is underground cable. Okay. So the black material that you see here, this is fluoropolymer material. So every underground cable that's put underground, they're putting a fluoropolymer insulation around it. They're basically wrapping it in a fluoropolymer material. Why? You don't want environmental conditions to affect the integrity of this cable. You certainly don't want it to be easily damaged. So even if someone is using a shovel, this is pretty resistant. All right, somebody might need a chainsaw or something else to try to cut through cable like this, but it allows it to stay and remain, but again, non-toxic. So it's not creating an adverse effect on the environment. So let me just pass that around. It's also extremely important in wiring. So in all kinds of different applications. So this wiring is for electric vehicles. It has a interesting property, but again, that's an environment that gets very hot. There's a lot of difficult conditions when an electric engine operates for long periods of time. You need a special wiring to go into it. That's what fluoropolymers do. On the other side is airplane wiring, which is this. So airplane wiring, same thing. You don't want that wiring to be easily damaged. You want it to be able to survive in all kinds of conditions. The other thing that uses fluoropolymers a lot are O-rings. I don't know if you've ever seen an O-ring, but O-rings and gaskets, especially for industrial applications. So almost most pieces of major industrial equipment are using fluoropolymer O-rings or fluoropolymer gaskets. Why? Again, you need that to last and be very, very safe. So it's an excellent material for those purposes. The other thing that I also like to just show, which is this is a fuel hose. So inside this fuel hose has a fluoropolymer product on the inside of this fuel hose. Why? Fuel is very, very, very tough on any material, right? Especially if it's running through and in hot conditions, cold conditions, that fluoropolymer material insulates the tube. So it doesn't break, it doesn't crack, and certainly will last a lot longer. So they're in all kinds of products, heart stents, pacemakers, computers, wiring and other components are fluoropolymer materials in computers and laptops, cell phones. Again, they're encased in some product and they need to last. And that's why fluoropolymers wound up being invented a number of years ago. And that's why they're used in all of these different kinds of applications. And for sure, for alternate energy sources, hydrogen power, you have to have a fluoropolymer membrane. Nothing else will last. For windmills, fluoropolymers are used to help protect the outside of the windmill, plus cabling to take the power to the generation station. And even solar panels, other than wiring, you are now starting to see companies put a fluoropolymer thin film top of the solar panel to protect it from hail, which around the country, that's the biggest reason solar panels have to be replaced, is they get damaged by hail. So, or other storms, right? You might get windstorms and trees and other things that would damage the solar panel. So it is a really, really excellent material. And it is not a material that is going to cause the problems that really everyone's trying to address with their PFAS legislation. And so in New Mexico, the secretary has agreed and has recommended to the legislature to exempt fluoropolymers from their bill. So that's gone to committee, was approved in committee last night, and it's gone to the House floor, and we expect that exemption to remain and be a part of that final bill. Colorado we essentially have an exemption because they did not have a broad ban on PFAS products. Broad bans, obviously, because of the broad definition, encompasses everything. So fluoropolymers get swept into that, but they are essentially not covered by that law as well. And we're talking to other states and to try to help them understand the nature of fluoropolymers and to try to help them appreciate that this isn't the material we believe that anyone is trying to go after and to stop. These are actually very, very beneficial materials. Our company is, always searching for alternatives. And, we work on that all the time around the world. Someday an alternative may come that's better than fluoropolymers. I expect that will happen at some point in the future, but right now fluoropolymers are the best material. Our customers want those materials because, again, they want their products to last and to be safe. So what we are asking is for the this committee and for the legislature here in Vermont to include in the bill an exemption for fluoropolymers, as we believe will happen now in New Mexico once the bill is approved on the floor in the Senate. And would appreciate your consideration, and we're happy to work with the committee, obviously, and the legislature to work through these issues. So thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Representative Chapin.
Thanks for your testimony. I think we're learning a lot about the complexity of lots of products out there that, but we have updated a version of the bill that we're looking at.
Mhm.
We're now only looking at cleaning products, dental floss, and fluorinated containers. And in addition to the products that we
Previously,
last year. So I guess I just, I don't believe this would affect, we would need that carve out in this bill. But in future, if we move towards a broader regulatory structure, we'd be in that position. We've changed the bill significantly since the first one that we just want, if you have a comment on those particular areas of cleaning products, dental floss or fluorinated containers, or just wanted to also just share that change.
no, and I see the chairwoman has joined, so nice to meet you. It's a very good question. It's going to depend on how the definitions play out. So I think our concern is some of the definitions, especially on intentionally added, are broad enough to bring fluoropolymers in to consideration on some of these products. So again, for us, best thing is just to include the exemption up front, and that therefore it doesn't matter, because I'm sure this legislature will look at further acts in the future, ways to potentially look at other products that might have to be banned. We just wanted to ask that the exemption be included now, so again, you won't be hearing from us again. And we would support a bill that had that exemption in it.
And if Tank will be.
PEX pipe, Viton O-rings, HDPE O-rings is the product you're talking about in those products? The fluorocarbons.
It probably, I don't know that for sure though, but I would expect that's what they're using, yes.
Representative North.
Yeah, so you indicated that the fluoropolymers are non-toxic. What testing do we have to show that that class of PFAS is non-toxic? Toxicological tests have been done to show.
Well, there's two things to answer that question. One is that the chemical makeup of these materials themselves doesn't allow them to, again, get absorbed into the body. It doesn't allow them to get absorbed into water or groundwater. You know, you touch this, there's nothing coming off of this. It's completely solid. That's why fluoropolymers are unique, because you're talking about a completely solid material that is not going to have anything come off of it. That's why it's inert. I somewhat, compare it to sometimes just a sheet of glass, which is also an inert material. And if it's, when it's sitting there, it's fine, right? There's nothing coming off of that piece of glass that's going to cause an environmental concern. So second is there are peer-reviewed studies that have looked at fluoropolymers, and those peer-reviewed studies have found them that they're a polymer of low concern. So, that's certainly something if members wanted to see that kind of information, we could certainly share it.
How do you spell it?
All right, I might get it wrong because I always have to think about it, but it is FLUOROPOLYMERS.
So it's fluoropolymers.
Fluoropolymers, yes, fluoropolymers.
And are there, if they were exempted, are there loopholes where some toxic substances would be fluoropolymers?
No. No, if it's a fluoropolymer, it's made up of a very specific set of bonds and carbons and molecule size. It would not be a toxic material.
I'm just doing a quick on that spelling, it says exposure to fluoropolymer containing waterproofing agents can cause lung injury and usually produce abrupt onset of respiratory and flu-like symptoms.
Those are actually not fluoropolymer materials. They're fluorochemicals. So I didn't want to say it incorrectly. So actually those materials are being phased out by most of the companies that are using them. And we've actually developed an alternative that does not have any fluorine in it. So
I guess-
but that is not actually a
I guess my
fluoropolymer.
point is using that word for a search, it looks like there's a loophole right there.
Well, we have a very specific definition that would not allow a loophole to occur, which basically involves a specific description of what a fluoropolymer is. And that it would be solid. Because we recognize there are concerns about sprays and those kinds of.
I don't know anything about the chemistry. I was just doing an internet search and trying to figure out what it said, and that was the first thing that popped up.
Sure.
Okay.
No, fair question. Yeah.
Yeah. So our definition of PFAS means a class of fluorinated, you probably have looked at this, organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom.
Correct.
Does your product have one fully
Well,
fluorinated?
It has at least one, right? So that's why when I mentioned the definition in the act
Yeah.
brings the entire class of PFAS chemicals, 14,000 plus different chemicals. It brings all of them under the umbrella of coverage.
Mm-hmm.
So fluoropolymers have more than one. They actually have more than two fully fluorinated carbons. And again, they're bonded together to create a larger molecule than you could see with other PFAS compounds.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Carnegie? I guess that's it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your time today.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
For today, folks. Tomorrow morning we'll be looking at draft committee bill with Michael O'Grady and DEC on the 3-acre storm. And also walking through the language for 238 that should be posted now, the updated PFAS. So we'll see you tomorrow morning at 9. We may need to also be flexible after the floor this week in order to try to see how much progress we make on these two topics, but we may need to go a little later.